Breaking news, folks, and I hope you're sitting down, because Atlanta's nightlife just turned into a full-blown reality show on steroids. Picture this: one of the city's most exclusive clubs, a VIP guest list hotter than a fresh batch of Popeye's biscuits, and enough champagne flowing to irrigate a small desert. But instead of ending in selfies and overpriced Uber rides home, the night exploded into chaos. Lil Scrappy, yes, T-H-A-T, Lil Scrappy, found himself face-to-face with Kirk Frost and young Jock in what witnesses are calling the most awkward, tense, and low-key terrifying moment since Kanye snatched that mic from Taylor Swift. But here's the question: was this a random confrontation? Or a premeditated hit job in designer sneakers? Did we just witness an unplanned spat? Or a carefully staged takedown for the cameras? Because the way these men locked eyes across that dance floor, honey, it had season finale cliffhanger written all over it. And you better believe I've got the receipts. I'm talking leaked messages, anonymous sources, and some seriously shady footage that's about to blow this whole thing wide open. So grab your popcorn, because what went down last night might just change Atlanta's club scene forever. Now, before we dive into what happened inside that club, we have to rewind and understand the storm that had been brewing for weeks, maybe months, because this was not some random night where tempers suddenly flared. This was the result of a slow burn, a buildup of tension that had been whispered about in backrooms, hinted at in social media posts, and muttered under breaths in crowded studios. Lil Scrappy, Kirk Frost, and young Jock are no strangers to controversy. In fact, if Atlanta's entertainment scene had its own Mount Rushmore of drama, their faces would be carved into the stone. Lil Scrappy, the rapper with a gift for turning petty insults into quotable lines, had been holding court in the city's club scene for years. He was the guy everyone wanted at their table, the one who could make the night feel bigger just by being there. But lately, the word from more than one anonymous source was that Scrappy had been letting his mouth run a little too freely. There were reports of him calling out certain love and hip-hop veterans as irrelevant, washed up, and clinging to the fame they once had. And while he never said names directly, everyone in the room seemed to know exactly who he was talking about. Kirk Frost's name had been popping up in these whispered conversations more than once. Kirk, the so-called businessman of the group, had long been surrounded by rumors of shady deals, questionable investments, and personal scandals that never seemed to go away. From denying a child on national television to being caught in more than one compromising situation, Kirk had the kind of history that made him an easy target. Then there was young Jock, the man who could walk into a room, flash that famous smile, and leave you wondering whether he was your friend or your enemy. Known for his unpredictable hairstyles and his ability to be at the center of gossip without breaking a sweat, Jock had a reputation for hearing something in confidence and making sure it spread like wildfire. Together, Kirk and Jock were not just friends, they were a pair with years of shared history, mutual secrets, and a united front when it came to protecting their reputations. In the weeks leading up to that night, tensions between Scrappy and the Kirk-Jock alliance had been building. People close to the situation claimed Scrappy had been feeling slighted, that certain deals and collaborations had been blocked by Kirk and Jock behind the scenes. Others insisted it was all ego, that Scrappy couldn't handle seeing Kirk and Jock get attention in the same spaces where he was used to being the main attraction. Whatever the truth was, the tension was no longer just rumor. It was visible in the way they interacted at events. It's the way they would pointedly avoid each other's tables, the absence of those once friendly public shout-outs. So when all three showed up at Atlanta's most exclusive nightclub on the same night, the air was already thick with anticipation. From the moment Scrappy arrived, the energy shifted. He slid into his VIP section like a man who owned the room, laughing loudly, raising his glass, shaking hands with familiar faces. Cameras followed him, phones came out, and before long his presence was the center of attention. Across the club, Kirk and Jock sat in their own booth, dressed to the nines. surrounded by their entourage, but their smiles didn't quite reach their eyes. Observers noted how often they glanced toward Scrappy's section, how their conversations seemed short, clipped, and occasionally interrupted by those subtle head nods in his direction. To anyone paying attention, it was clear they weren't just enjoying a night out, they were watching. The music was loud, the lights flashing, the crowd packed shoulder to shoulder, but underneath all that was the unspoken question of what would happen if these three ended up face to face. That question got answered faster than anyone expected. Kirk leaned toward Jock, said something in his ear, and they both stood at the same time. No hesitation, no lingering to finish their drinks. They began moving through the dance floor, their eyes locked on Scrappy like predators closing in. People in the crowd started to notice the shift. Conversations paused, dancers slowed, and heads turned as Kirk and Jock cut through the mass of bodies with one purpose. Scrappy was mid-laugh. When he caught sight of them approaching, his smile faded just enough for those closest to him to notice. He set his drink down and straightened his posture. Kirk stopped a few feet away, his hands in his pockets, while Jock stepped closer, closing the gap until there was no mistaking this wasn't a friendly visit. The music seemed to dull in the background as the space around them tightened, bodies shifting to give them room. Scrappy kept his voice calm, casual even, as he asked, "What's going on, fellas?" But there was a caution in his tone. His crew, seated behind him, was already watching closely, a couple of them half standing, ready to move if needed. Kirk didn't answer right away. He just stared at Scrappy with that unreadable expression, then finally said, "You've been running. Your mouth stirring up drama. You know exactly what I'm talking about." The words cut through the noise like a blade. Scrappy raised an eyebrow, gripping his glass a little tighter. "I don't know what you mean," he replied, but his usual easy confidence was edged with something sharper, more defensive. Jock stepped in then, his voice low but firm, telling Scrappy, "We've got plenty to say, and if you're smart, you'll listen." Scrappy didn't back down. "Like what?" he shot back, taking a small step forward, closing the space between them until they were almost toe to toe. The crowd leaned in, some instinctively stepping back, others pulling out their phones, knowing they might be about to capture the kind of moment that could go viral in seconds. Jock pointed a finger directly at him. "You've been talking out of line, spreading lies. You think you can just run your mouth without consequences?" Scrappy lifted his chin, meeting Jock's glare without flinching. "If I've got something to say, I'll say it. But don't come at me with weak accusations unless you've got something solid." That's when Kirk moved closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that was still somehow heard by everyone nearby. "We've got more than words. We've got receipts." He pulled out his phone, unlocked it, and held the screen up. Scrappy squinted at the glare, but couldn't make out the details. "So what now?" he challenged. "You going to show me some out-of-context messages? Miss me with that nonsense." His tone was still defiant, but there was the faintest crack in his armor now, a subtle shift in his stance that only those watching closely could see. Jock was now shoulder to shoulder with Kirk, the two of them a united wall of pressure. There, eyes locked on Scrappy as the music pounded on around them. The air between them felt heavy, as if the entire club had shifted its focus to this single moment. Scrappy held his ground, but his eyes darted briefly toward his crew. It's a silent acknowledgement that this was not just a casual disagreement. Kirk's stare was cold and unblinking, the kind that made it clear he was not there to exchange pleasantries. Jock's jaw was tight, his tone low but edged with challenge as he repeated that Scrappy had been speaking out of turn and that it was time to own up before things escalated. The crowd's energy had changed completely. Moments earlier, the space had been alive with music, dancing, and laughter. But now there was a tense hush over the area around them. Those closest leaned in to catch every word while others positioned themselves to film without being obvious. Scrappy's voice was steady, but there was a sharpness in it as he responded that nobody was going to press him in public. Not here, not tonight. Kirk stepped in closer, his words a near whisper, but sharp enough to cut through the bass in the background, telling Scrappy to keep talking and he would find out exactly how far they were willing to go. Scrappy's reply came fast, almost on instinct, insisting that he had never been afraid of either of them, and that nothing was about to change now. It was the kind of exchange where both sides refused to give an inch and where every look, every pause was loaded with meaning. Jock leaned forward slightly, his eyes locked on Scrappy's as if trying to read the exact moment he might flinch. Scrappy refused to look away. His crew hovered close but did not intervene. Knowing that jumping in too soon could send the situation from verbal to physical in a heartbeat. For a moment, it looked like that line was about to be crossed. Kirk shifted his stance, closing the last bit of distance between them, and Scrappy planted his feet in response. Then, before anyone could take that next step, a large figure emerged. From the edge of the crowd, one of the club's security guards moved in quickly, placing a firm hand on Kirk's shoulder while extending his other arm to keep space between the men. His voice was firm and commanding as he told them to take it outside or take a seat. That this was not the place for whatever they thought they were about to do. Kirk kept his eyes locked on Scrappy even as the guard guided him a step back. Jock did the same, his body language still tense, his posture unyielding. Scrappy's shoulders loosened slightly, but his gaze never wavered. Around them the crowd was buzzing again, whispers flying as people tried to piece together what they had just witnessed. The security guard motioned for Kirk and Jock to return to their booth. For a few seconds it seemed like they might resist, but then Kirk gave a small nod, slipped his phone back into his pocket, and backed away. He said nothing loud enough for the whole crowd to hear, but those close enough caught the quiet promise that they would settle this another time. Jock gave Scrappy one last look before turning to follow Kirk. The two of them walked back through the dance floor with the same deliberate pace they had approached with, parting the crowd without saying a word. Scrappy stayed where he was for a moment, breathing slow but deliberate, his crew forming a loose shield around him. One of his friends leaned in and asked if he was good, and Scrappy answered that he was fine, though the slight tension in his tone betrayed the fact that his mind was still replaying every second of what had just happened. He picked up his drink, took a measured sip, and told his crew that Kirk and Jock were all talk and always had been. But even as he said it, there was a flicker in his eyes that suggested he knew better. The look they had given him, the way they had moved together, the confidence in Kirk's voice when he mentioned having proof none of it sat right with him. The music picked back up. The crowd began to move again, but the energy in the club had shifted. People were no longer just there to dance and drink. They were watching. Word of the confrontation began spreading within minutes. People who had been near enough to witness parts of it were already recounting their versions to friends. Across the room, some swore Kirk and Jock had been ready to throw punches. Others claimed Scrappy had stood his ground so firmly they had no choice but to back down. It didn't matter what was true by the time those stories reached the far end of the club. They had already grown into something bigger than reality. Phones were out, fingers moving quickly across screens. A shaky video began making the rounds almost instantly. The clip was too far away to catch much dialogue, but it showed Kirk and Jock standing close to Scrappy, the body language between them tense and unmistakable. In a world where perception often mattered more than fact, the footage was enough to ignite the internet. Within minutes, hashtags started popping up. Kirk fees Scrappy Jock go receipts, club drama teal. The story was no longer confined to the four walls of the club. It had spilled out into the wider world, where everyone with a smartphone suddenly had an opinion.ac at their booth. Kirk checked his phone and saw the social media storm unfolding in real time. The comments were relentless, some praising him and Jock for finally confronting Scrappy, others mocking them for walking away without taking real action. He showed Jock the screen, muttering that people were acting like they were the villains. Jock shook his head and said it was just noise, but added that maybe it was time to set the record straight. Kirk's expression hardened, and he agreed quietly that they needed to handle it. Across the club, Scrappy's crew was also tracking the online explosion. One friend showed him a post calling him the king of the club. Another read a comment, praising him for standing up to two men at once. Scrappy managed a half smile, but his tone was serious when he said they were not done. That Kirk and Jock were sitting there plotting their next move. The night carried on, but the atmosphere was different now. Kirk and Jock no longer laughed or mingled. They sat quietly, occasionally glancing toward Scrappy's section. Their body language was less like party-goers and more like men working through a strategy. Scrappy returned to his seat, keeping up appearances, but he was more alert now, scanning the room every so often. Those close to him could tell he was unsettled. It wasn't fear exactly, but an awareness that whatever had just happened was far from finished. The night outside the club was thick with humidity and tension as the crowd began spilling into the parking lot long after the music had faded. Scrappy had made his way to the exit with his crew close behind, their conversations hushed but urgent. The faint glow of streetlights cast long shadows across the lot, and somewhere in the distance the faint roar of an engine echoed. A few fans who had recognized him tried to call out for pictures, but the mood in Scrappy's face made them think twice. He scanned the lot, his jaw set, his movements deliberate. Then, from across the rows of parked cars, Kirk and Jock emerged, their silhouettes unmistakable even in the dim light. They walked with a calm, steady pace, but there was a charge in the air that made the hairs on the back of Scrappy's neck stand up. His crew tightened their formation instinctively, ready for whatever might happen next. The sound of footsteps and the low hum of muffled conversations from bystanders mixed with the heavy thud of bass still seeping faintly from the club. Scrappy stood still, waiting, his eyes locked on the two men approaching. Kirk was the first to speak, his voice carrying easily across the few feet of space between them. He said that the earlier conversation inside the club had been unfinished, that there were things Scrappy needed to hear and answer for. Jock added that the cameras inside might have stopped them from handling it then. But now they were in the open with no one to interfere. Scrappy's reply was sharp and immediate, telling them he had nothing to explain. That if they wanted to make threats, they had picked the wrong night. Kirk smirked slightly and reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone and holding it up, just high enough for the faint light from the screen to reveal a blurred still image. He said it was all there, proof that Scrappy had been talking behind their backs. Proof that he had been running his mouth to people who didn't need to know their business. Scrappy stepped forward, narrowing the gap between them, demanding to see exactly what they were talking about. Jock shook his head and told him it was not just about the image, it was about the principle, about respect. X's voice grew harder as he accused Scrappy of forgetting where he came from, of thinking he was untouchable. The crowd in the lot had begun to grow, with people sensing that something was about to happen. Some stood in. Clusters, others held their phones up at chest level, recording discreetly. Scrappy's crew shifted again, keeping just close enough to act but not close enough to look like they were starting something. Then Kirk took one more step forward and said if Scrappy wanted to prove himself, now was the time. Scrappy's response came without hesitation, telling him that if they had a problem, they could solve it right there. Jock looked to Kirk, and in a split second, both of them moved closer. The space between the three men reduced to almost nothing. The first shove came fast, a sudden jolt of movement that sent Scrappy a half step back, and instantly the air was filled with shouts. Scrappy lunged forward, his hands up, not to punch, but to push back hard, and within seconds their crews were in motion. The lot became chaos, bodies moving, shouts and curses blending with the muffled sound of car alarms triggered in the commotion. Security from the club rushed out, trying to separate the groups. their voices booming over the noise, ordering everyone to back up. Kirk's voice was still cutting through it all, throwing accusations even as security pushed him toward the edge of the lot. Jock's face was tense, his eyes darting around as if assessing whether the night was about to end with someone in cuffs. Scrappy was breathing hard, his friends pulling him back while telling him it was not worth it. That the last thing he needed was to be on the news for a parking lot brawl. But the cameras were already there. Multiple angles, shaky and grainy, captured every moment. From the first step Kirk and Jock took toward Scrappy to the moment security wedged themselves between them. In the age of instant uploads, it was only minutes before the first clips hit social media. By the time Scrappy was halfway down the street in his car, the videos had been reposted thousands of times. Comments poured in, some calling it a setup, others insisting that Scrappy had been ambushed. Kirk and Jock's names trended alongside his, and everyone had their own version of what really happened. The noise online was deafening. People dissected every frame of the footage, slowing it down to catch facial expressions, speculating on what was said, even claiming to read lips. In the following hours, fake accounts claiming to have been eyewitnesses popped up, adding fuel to the fire. One claimed that Scrappy had thrown the first shove. Another insisted Kirk had been holding a weapon, though no such thing could be seen in the videos. The rumors spiraled until they barely resembled the truth, but in the world of viral gossip, truth was irrelevant. It was about clicks, shares, and outrage. News blogs picked it up within the hour, each headline more sensational than the last. Some called it a feud years in the making, others framed it as an inevitable clash of egos by morning. The story had crossed from entertainment gossip into mainstream news. Radio hosts debated it. Talk shows hinted at inviting the men on for interviews, and fan pages posted long threads dissecting every piece of available footage. Scrappy stayed silent publicly, but those close to him said he was livid. Not just about the confrontation, but about how it had been spun. Kirk and Jock, meanwhile, posted cryptic messages on their social media accounts, hinting that more was to come, that the parking lot was just the beginning. Their followers speculated wildly, convinced that a bigger revelation was around the corner. The tension in the city's nightlife scene was palpable. Club owners quietly passed word to security teams to be on alert if any of the three showed up. Friends of all parties began taking sides, some urging reconciliation, others egging the conflict on. For the fans, it was entertainment, a real-life drama playing out in real time. But for those involved, it was something heavier, a mix of pride, ego, and the dangerous awareness that every move they made from here on out would be watched, recorded, and judged. As the sun set on the following day, there was no official statement from any of them. No press conference, no apologies. Just the lingering sense that what had happened in that club and in that parking lot was only the opening act to a much larger storm brewing on the horizon. And now here we are with the smoke still hanging in the air and the questions getting louder by the minute. Because if this was just the beginning, then what on earth is coming next? Was this truly about words exchanged in a club? Or is there a deeper beef going back years? Was Scrappy really blindsided, or did he know exactly what kind of energy Kirk and Jock were bringing to that parking lot? And more importantly, who is going to drop the next bombshell in this saga? Because you and I both know, this is not over. We are talking about egos, money, loyalty, and betrayal, all swirling in a pot that has been boiling for far too long. The streets are talking, the blogs are spinning, and every single person with a phone in their hand is ready to hit record when round two comes crashing in. So I want to hear from you right now. Was this a setup or a fair fight? Who crossed the line and who is playing the victim? Drop your theories in the comments, because the truth here is up for grabs, and until it drops, you better stay locked in. Like, share, and subscribe for the next wave.